Welcome back to another edition of Rock Forever. We've got a very special guest. He is the author of so many of our favorite books. He's got over 80 of them out. We're going to be talking about the new sweet book, Rebel Rouser, and all the great stuff about this band. Either you're a hardcore fan or you need to be. So please welcome the author, Martin Popoff.
Yes, thanks for having me, Jay. Very cool.
Yeah, awesome to have you. It's always great to talk to someone that loves music like you do. You pour your heart into these books. You've got great photographers that you work with, but you put that extra special touch, whether it be some memorabilia or the stories behind. And I always say the music is finite. There's only so many albums out there, whatever the band may be, but to really dig into how they made those records, who these guys are, where they came from, how it all gelled or fell apart, that's going to give you a better perspective and more appreciation really for the music than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I hope these books do is they get people, going back to the records and playing them and listening for that little sound or whatever and comparing the production of this album and that album and checking out the lyrics and saying, oh, that's what he was talking about, after having read it in the book or whatever. So, that's, it's basically playing DJ, right? It's the same thing.
Yeah, it really is. And we live in such a visual time these days, people want to see the photos, they want to see a video. They really, they enjoy music with their eyes as much as their ears these days.
Yeah.
So,
for sure.
yeah, hats off to you, to all that you do. And, we're going to be talking, like I said in the intro, I always find with a band like Sweet, you're either a hardcore fan, you love them, you can't get enough, or you're like, who the hell is Sweet? In America and probably Canada, they're known for a handful of songs, Ballroom Blitz, Fox on the Run, Action, Love is Like Oxygen. But beyond there, they're like, I'm not sure who the band was that did that song, but I know the song. And I always say, we like to turn people on to great undiscovered music. So if you're one of those that are like, I kind of know, I heard the name, but we're going to dive a little deeper. And of course, the key all-star lineup is Andy Scott on guitars, Steve Priest on bass, Mick Tucker on drums, and Brian Connolly on vocals. And I first came across them. Of course, I heard Little Willie and some of that AM radio stuff back in the early 70s. But, 1975, I lived all over the world, but I was living in Panama, Central America, hence the celebration every time I hear the Van Halen song. But it was my senior year of high school, and I had heard Ballroom Blitz on the radio, and I went over to visit these hot girls with a friend of mine, and bam, there it was, the cover of Desolation Boulevard. Little did I know I'd be moving to LA in that backdrop of the Sunset Strip, in front of these guys that just looked like they had attitude, man. They were stylish, they were definitely, flamboyant, starting to get into the Bowies and the T-Rex, you knew these guys were driving the girls crazy, and you started listening to that album. And of course, here in America, Desolation Boulevard was a compilation of a few albums, those in England and Germany and the rest of the world, got on the Sweet much earlier. But in America, Capitol Records kind of compiled that album. And of course, Mike Chapman, who's known for so many hits, with the Knack and Pat Benatar and, Blondie and so many groups, the man with the golden touch, was behind not only writing, but producing some of these. And of course, Phil Wainman, one of their core producers. So talk about putting this together. I know obviously they had 13 top 20 hits, in the 70s alone. But when you started compiling this, what was your goal?
Well, like a lot of my books, I mean, I've had these various situations where I've done this Ye Olde Metal series of books where I've just had like one or two albums talked about and then 15 chapters of albums by different bands. And I did like 6 of those books. And then I had these email or ebook format documents of a couple of the Sweet albums already done. So sometimes when there's a little bit of a base to start on, I figure, well, what would it take to roll that into a whole book? So I basically went out and got some more interviews and looked at all the articles and put together a little press archive and talked to Andy again. And eventually I thought, well, I could put this whole thing together. But one of the reasons I wanted to is that I do want to turn people on to Sweet, but also the idea is that there's just very little out there on them other than, the old articles. But in terms of book form, there's very little out there on them. So I just thought it was one of these cool bands, and it's a finite band, right? You talk about the music being finite. This is really finite, right? Because there's only one guy left in the band. There's only one guy left standing now, and he's the last one left alive. But essentially the band ended at the beginning of the 80s anyways, in terms of, Sweet. And then there's a long epilogue in this book about what happened after that, various stuff. But no, I mean, so I had this base, and then I just figured how can I get this to a full book? And it had the right amount of albums to talk about that make up a book. It's not one of these bands where they've got 4 albums I love and I want to talk about those 4 albums, but they put out 20 albums and I got to do a whole chapter on 16 more albums. So, they fell in that sweet spot, so to speak.
Yeah, of course. Like I say, in America, they're mainly known for Desolation Boulevard, Give Us a Wink, Off the Record, and Level Headed. They had problems with Brian after that and became a trio, and unfortunately, really went downhill as far as having any kind of radio play and all that. But over in England, again, known from like 1970, 71, 72, they were a singles band, and they were always on top of the pops. They were always trying to out glam Mark Bolan or, Bowie and all that. It got pretty crazy. But again, we're talking about, teenage music. And I always say where the hot teenage girls go is where the boys will follow, and Sweet had that fanatical, female following, and they were chanting right along with Blockbuster and Teenage Rampage, Fox on the Run, Action, and all those songs. Of course, early on, they didn't necessarily like so many bands from that era. I know it's hard for people to understand that now, but they weren't able to play on their records. They were mainly the guys that sang and played live. But back then, like the Wrecking Machine or the Wrecking Crew, they had the record companies had these crews that would just go in and knock out the music, So Sweet were like, F that, we're a real band. And they had that fight, that kind of genesis of them coming out and saying, no, we can write these songs. We can oversee the production. And of course, I know Fox on the Run was a real key to that, because the original Fox on the Run came out in the Sweet FA album, and it was not as catchy as when the record label said, I think there's a single here. You guys need to go back in and, produce that tighter, better, stronger. And Fox on the Run is one of the all-time classics. And that intro, hearing that little synth, keys is obviously influenced, Van Halen with that intro to Dancing, in the Streets. And of course, Sweet heavily influenced bands like Motley Crue and Cheap Trick, Billy Idol, Enough's Enough, Bon Jovi, Cinderella, Poison, Rat. They were super catchy songs. And these guys were for real, obviously their songs have been covered by the Vince Neil Band and Steve Stevens and the Atomic Playboys and so many, bands over the years, but so underrated and underappreciated, especially here in North America. Talk a little bit about, what you saw as the history of this band that had become so big in England and Germany and Australia, but hadn't translated besides a top 40 hit or so, here in America, and that transition of them kind of coming to America and trying to stake their claim.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a Chin Chapman situation early on, and that thing about them not playing on them didn't last too particularly long, but the writing of those hits did last through Chapman Chin. And then, and they were also writing for Mud and Susie Quattro and those kinds of bands. So specifically at the ramp up to the transition to the States, there was sort of a false start in a way with the album that came out on Bell. Let's see, do I have that handy here? So we've got, hang on, there we go, right? at the bottom. There we go. So this album, the Sweet,
Yeah, with Little
featuring Little
Willie.
Willie and Blockbuster, which was made to look like the Hershey's Kiss colors, right, with the silver and the brown. But the thing about this record, so this is their debut in the States, but it also is a compilation. But it's living off of the sort of success of like your Wigwam Bams and Little Willie especially, right? Hellraiser. So this is already a mix of those singles, and the singles actually started getting pretty heavy too, even by the time of Little Willie. I remember my introduction to this band was Little Willie on one of those KTEL compilations, and it was pretty heavy. So it was fine. But the big transformation to the States, as you indicated, is Desolation Boulevard, in terms of this compilation between the Sweet Fanny Adams album and the UK Desolation Boulevard. And yeah, I just remember it was Sweet Mania there because of Fox on the Run. And, for the guys, maybe even more so Ballroom Blitz, but also like Set Me Free and No You Don't and Sweet FA, these really heavy songs. It was mostly the Sweet Fanny Adams album and not actually the Desolation Boulevard album, because that one was a little more raw and weird and obscure. But Sweet Fanny Adams is essentially most of what we got over here. And that was the one record that went gold for them. It never to happen again. But at that point, they're still having this tugging match with Chapman Chin, saying, no, we can write our own, and they're saying, no, you're nothing without us, kind of thing. And the funny thing is, those guys proved that they could write the totally technical heavy metal songs as well. So they did a little bit of that as you go along, but then Sweet made the clean break with Give Us a Wink, which I think is an absolute masterpiece of early heavy metal. It's the 1975/76 follow-up to Desolation Boulevard, and then I think Off the Record is a very underrated album, and that did nothing. And then even Give Us a Wink did, the excitement was already kind of over, although Action was an absolute masterpiece. I always consider it their Bohemian Rhapsody, right? But so that was quite a bit of a hit, but the rest of the album, not really any hits. The album itself, not really hits. So Sweet Mania was a very short-lived thing. And to reiterate, it had this small little burst of excitement with Little Willie, but not really that brown record that I just showed you, but quite a bit bigger of a blast with a few of those hits off of Desolation Boulevard.
Yeah, I know there was a little bit of confusion too, because originally known as the Sweet, or even before that, the Sweet Shop,
Mhm.
in the UK, and coming to America, they realized that, man, the days of the move and the this and the that, that it was kind of over, and I always, really felt more comfortable as the band Sweet,
Yeah.
it really kind of a little unnecessary confusion, but just an evolution of the band, as in, writing their own songs. But I remember again when Desolation Boulevard came out, 75, 76, they Capitol had put them on the road with, like, the Bob Seger band, which, Bob Seger was rocking, but it was nowhere near, what we're talking about, with Sweet. It should have been teenage girls and guys, like they were going to a Poison or Motley Crue show. Bob Seger was a little older, and beards, and blue collar. Sweet was definitely, glam and in your face, and obviously influenced all the Sunset Strip bands of the 80s and all that since. But like you say, it's a bittersweet tale, when you hear this band that had so much promise and left us with this string of great songs and albums, but never fully realized their potential, here in America. So I think, like I say, it's always good to turn people on to, bands that they might not know as much, or they know that song, but they don't know the records. Like you say, Off the Record, there's a good 5, 6 great songs. Windy City, all those songs,
Yeah.
Lost Angels.
Yeah.
But again, they didn't have a big, radio hit on there. But now comes Level Headed, and Love Is Like Oxygen put them right back on the radio. I think it's a 7-8 minute song on the album, but they had that perfect 3.5 minute, edit for radio. Super catchy, chorus. You get too much, you get too high, not enough, and you're gonna die. I mean, what an amazing comeback in a way. But in America, it's almost you're either huge or you're nobody, because the record company support and all that goes away if you're not. We saw that with Stars, we saw that with Angel, we saw that with so many bands, that if you don't really deliver the sales, you don't quite make it to that upper echelon of a Aerosmith, or obviously a Van Halen or something like that. Talk a little bit about you know the what you feel some of their influences has been in other bands.
Yeah, it's funny because that era 71 to 74 is considered a glam rock era in the UK, and then that's also a term that's applied to the hair metal era from 83 to 91, right? So it's the same term. So often there more links are made, or more is made of that link than is warranted. But with Sweet, the funny thing is, so they come from an era named after the same thing. But I think the main thing with Sweet is that they did come up with this interesting yet hooky, quite technical metal, which influenced those other bands, but also these beautiful harmonies, these stacked harmonies that, there's always this war, and it's talked about a little in the book about, Queen ripped us off kind of thing. So there were two bands doing that similar thing, but the vocal thing, I think, is another thing that influenced these bands later. But yes, you do see covers of Set Me Free and No You Don't over the years, and what are a couple of Ballroom Blitz definitely was covered, Fox on the Run. So they were a pretty important band in that. But yeah, the whole glam look of that early days is quite different than the glam look of the hair metal look. Sweet was not a good looking bunch of guys, contrary, to the idea that obviously the girls loved the whole thing, right? But I think they loved that little bit of makeup and the sparkle and the flashy clothes and the campness of the whole thing. But they were not particularly, just au naturel, great looking guys, right? And then they ran into the problem of they didn't know what to wear and what to look like and stuff. So it got into the sort of like slacks and satin shirts era, and the beards came back and all this. And then the music changed as well. So that was the other big problem with Sweet, is that Andy eventually made quite an extreme bout face into this sort of 10cc pomp rock, pop, progginess, ELO. He was listening to a lot of fusion and stuff, which he talks about in the book. Like he really just decided, we don't want to do this hard rock thing anymore. And it was not particularly that it wasn't working for them. It wasn't working fast enough, that's for sure. But it was almost like, despite them having, the booze and the cocaine problems and the marital issues and the shagging on the road and all this stuff, as they say in the UK, Benny Hill, right? But despite living this rock star, rock pig life in a way, in a lot of ways, they still prided themselves on the music. They had big egos too, but they did pride themselves on the music. Mick Tucker is an amazing drummer. He's always talked about in that same sort of class as an Ian Pace, right? Similar kind of drummer. Brian Downey from Thin Lizzy. But yeah, so they got much mellower on the next album, and then the next album again, Water's Edge / Sweet Six, and then Identity Crisis. So they cut above the rest, right? Much mellower than the last heavy metal album, which was off the record. But they did have that one hit that kind of kept the party going a little bit, as you mentioned, Love Is Like Oxygen, and then Discophony was a little bit of a hit on cut above the rest. But of course, at that point, Brian Connolly is bounced out of the band because his drinking just cannot be stopped, and then he just has a slow, sad, painful decline and dies. What is it? 10, 15 years later. You know, it's a little bit like the David Byron story. You think,
Yeah,
oh, he's out of the band because he died. No, he lingered for a long time, right?
yeah. No,
And
it's super sad to see the deterioration in his
yeah,
voice and his look and
yeah,
everything, because they may not have been the ultimate pinup models, but they had a style, and the girls did
mhm,
love them. You look at that cover of Desolation Boulevard, and the girls definitely wanted to meet these guys, you know.
yeah,
And you look at the back cover of like Motley Crue, Theater of Pain, that whole era look. To me, that's sweet. That's right there.
yeah,
I
yeah.
knew Nikki
True.
Sixx has said we wanted to be sweet, and I
Mhm.
know one of Tommy Lee's heroes is Mick Tucker. I mean, one of the most underrated drummers ever.
Yeah. 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 It's funny though. I look at the sweet makeup and it looks like so half-assed, right? It's like, oh, we'll just throw something on just to provoke people, right? Just to get talked about in the press. And then they'll pout and they'll act like, you know, we're gay on stage and they were anything but, right? But they would play that camp thing and they would kind of flirt with the guys or whatever. And it was almost like a punk rock attitude, right? It was almost like in your face, we're literally just trying to get a reaction. It's almost like bikers kissing each other on the lips, right? It's a little bit like we're trying to be outlaws here with what we're doing, right? Um, so that whole thing was but it, you know, in terms of the makeup, it was not, you know, painfully applied Kiss makeup. It was just like throw some sparkle on her face or whatever, right? Or just, yeah, let's wear that, that'll get them talking, right? So it was a kind of a ridiculous, it was one of the worst, most ridiculous glam looks of all those bands. The probably the least tasteful, although Slade could look pretty bad, and Mud in the, you know, the matching show band suits and stuff like that. That was a whole different thing, right? But no, on Desolation Boulevard, they've kind of cleaned up. They're right in the middle there before they're into the satin shirts and the kind of like upscale look. They do have a little bit of a harder rock look with attitude, and that is that sweet spot right between right at Desolation Boulevard and Give Us a Wink.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, it was um, interviewing Steve Priest, and I was lucky enough to know Steve very well, and I did one of his last interviews, if not his last, in his home
Mm,
here in La Cañada,
yeah,
and
wow.
so sad to see Steve go, you know, and sad to see two suites, you know. It was the Europe suite and the North American suite, and it was too bad, you know. But obviously, the prime to me was that 75 through 80. You know, if people don't really know this band, Desolation Boulevard, Give Us a Wink, Off the Record, Level Headed, are the albums, and hopefully there's some more compilations of all the songs on one. I know it's a little difficult because they were on different labels in different countries, and RCA and Capitol and EMI and different stuff, but you know those are the classic era. And talking to Steve, he said it was just ridiculous because Top of the Pops was on every week, and all the British press, the NMEs and Melody Makers and Sounds On, came out every week. So it wasn't like this big, you know, they could look back and have this big wide picture. It was like, well, what are we going to put on this week to turn heads and piss off the dads, you know, thinking, oh, these poofters, you know, who are they, you know?
Yeah.
And he said it became this contest with, you know, with Mark Bolan. It's like, who's going to have the most glitter around the eyes, or who's going to have the biggest feathered boa or something? And obviously over here, it was hard for your average rock fan to relate to that. But, you know, this is the era of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. You know, it was really, it was out there. But to me, I say, listen to the music. You know, the music really stands up in that era. And hats off to Andy Scott for, you know, keeping it alive. Had many great conversations and times with Andy, and was right there when they came back to California in that 1989 or 92, or
Right.
you know, when they were promoting live at the Marquee.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's a bygone era. It's, you know, time captured in a bottle. I always, you know, Andy lets you know that there's fans in Germany and throughout Europe and England and Australia that keep the band alive. To them, they're just as big as other huge bands from the 70s. And They continue to put out compilations, and I know his new album is Isolation Boulevard. With all the pandemic isolation going on,
Mhm.
but what an era! Phil Wainman was an amazing producer.
Yeah.
Mike Chapman, they called it Chinny Chap, but we all know Mike Chapman was the force, in that partnership. And I know Mike's working on a documentary himself, and can't wait to see that. I mean, the number of hits that they churned out was pretty remarkable. But
Yeah.
to really look at this classic era, Fox on the Run, Hellraiser. Oh, speaking of Hellraiser, I mean, I don't think I'm the only one, and Steve definitely rolled his eyes in realizing that Motley Crue, Kickstart Your Heart, to me, the best song on Dr. Feelgood, their biggest album, is a complete ripoff, the chords of Hellraiser. And I
Yeah.
know there's only so many chords on a guitar, and I'm sure Mick Mars and Nikki would have a laugh at it, like, yeah, man, of course,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But Hellraiser is the original Kickstart My Heart, and that was super heavy and hard, in the middle of
Yeah.
their teenage rampage there.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, and we talk about that era, but it's like, yes, they had the hit single era, they had the heavy metal era, then they had the sort of pomp rock era, and then they closed off even a little heavier again. But I think one of the other things that hopefully people will appreciate is that they did have all those B-sides and those singles that weren't on albums. And so there is that American compilation, or the Sweet's Biggest Hits, which was sort of a British version of the album that comes after the original album. Everybody forgets about. That's the funny how sweet Coco can be, and that's a compilation of the hits that aren't so heavy. And then, of course, the German copy has one of their heavy, self-penned songs stuck at the end of it, which isn't on the British one. But there's enough early music even before you get to Sweet Fanny Adams that is pretty darn good and pretty heavy. So you can get those on all these compilations, like I say, Sweet's Biggest Hits, or this American one, and Strung Up, with the double album that came out with the Joe Patagno artwork on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this was a band with a lot more material beyond even the key albums. But I truly believe Give Us a Wink for sure is a stone cold 10 out of 10, and the production is just glorious on it. Working at Musicland in Munich and Mac and all that stuff. Great, incredible sounds across that, and then all the the complication and the challenge of having those big vaulted cathedral vocals all over everything. So yeah, quite a distinct sound, very talented guys, but it's just a funny story of, like I say, a rock pig life. They were kind of like that. They're like a rock cliche, how every band thinks Spinal Tap is written about them. Well, Sweet definitely has that going for them as well. And then, like I say, egos in the band, drug abuse and booze, but yet such talented guys. But I guess one of the big tragedies of this band is their talent was tamped down at the very beginning, and then at the end, it was almost like tamped down by fatigue and by despondency at nobody caring about them anymore. Because with Brian gone, one of the kind of things about the tragedies of there being a UK suite and an American suite, a California suite, it is also the fact that both of those guys could sing great, and on Cut Above the Rest, you barely even feel the absence of Brian. But when you move the thing into where it really matters, like the whole package that is a career, and you have to go out and play live and stuff, missing that front man and how important that guy is, it just falls flat. And at that point, as you can see in the book, they're starting to grouse about not being headliners anymore, and having shortened sets and all that. But it totally makes sense. The band is way worse off live without Brian than they are on records. They could have continued to make good records. And then I guess the other tragedy is could they not have gotten Brian better? and just stuck with it and figured out, obviously in the 70s, they didn't have the same tools and the same attitude about, drug and alcohol abuse. And he was kind of left to his own devices, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And he was bounced out of the band. So yeah, a lot of tragedy to this tale, but again, a lot of just wanting to turn people on to a bunch of really great music.
Well, that's it. We celebrate the good times. They had some incredible sold out concerts at the Santa Monica Civic right out
Mm.
here by the beach in Santa Monica in LA. And a little side note, if those that don't know, Ed Leffler was their manager here in the U.S., who managed Van Halen, 5150 on, and of course managed Sammy Hagar. And they were poised. They were poised, to do their thing. And of course, America back then in the mid to late 70s was just radio dominated. This is well before MTV. Could you imagine if this it all happened in the early 80s with MTV? I mean, Sweet could have been one of the biggest groups, in America. I mean, they had a look and a swagger and a style, but yeah, they had that attitude, and we're here to celebrate, the best of them. And again, hands down, from Desolation Boulevard, Give Us a Wink, Off the Record, and Level Headed. And yeah, like you say, those high harmonies, especially with Andy Scott and Steve Priest, was remarkable. If you love Queen, check them out. Yeah, they're again a fun loving band. And that's another thing. The intro to Ballroom Blitz, where they're acting, you know, a little feminine at the beginning of that. Are you ready, Steve?
Yeah.
And they played up on that, and then the band comes crashing in with the Ballroom Blitz chords and Mick Tucker on drums. I mean, they showed you, if you thought this was a wimpy band, you're sadly mistaken. So it was the nature of the beast, back then with Top of the Pops. People people in America, it's hard to realize that because we had MTV 24/7, in the 80s. But back then in the 70s, you had like a 1 hour show once a week on BBC TV, and that was the only channel. It wasn't like you had a lot of different channels to choose from back then, in England. And boy, everybody watched that show, and from the T-Rexes to Bowie to Badfinger to you name it, they really made their popularity on that and those type of TV shows, even more so than radio. BBC One may not even have played much, pop or rock, during the day. They're everything to everybody, and you're going to get less and less and less. Maybe a couple Beatles songs or something, but it was a different era. But to look back fondly on a band that had an incredible string of great songs and albums. Yeah, no, it's tragic, and certainly would have made for one of those behind the music specials where they always love to show the demise of a group. But all the way to the end, Steve Priest and still Andy Scott to the day can't walk out on stage without playing Fox on the Run, Ballroom Blitz, Action, Love Is Like Oxygen. These are the soundtracks to so many people's lives that grew up during the 70s.
Yeah. Yeah, and those early singles sold in the hundreds of thousands and up to low millions, I think, in some places. It's hard to even, you mentioned it's hard to remember a world without MTV. It's hard to remember a world where little 45 RPM records just sold by the truckload, right? And that's one of the big places where they made a lot of money, right? So yeah, it's a whole funny thing. And I remember Ballroom Blitz. I think I mentioned this in the intro to this, but for some reason I've got the memory of that tied to the roller skating craze. Remember around that time with the roller rinks and everything, it was just one of those classic songs for that you'd hear coming off of the crappy hockey barn PA system thing, right? It was just so perfect for that with the drums and that caranging guitar and those pretty extreme vocals, which sound a little crazy, right? I remember as a kid, we we did this series with Banger Films called Metal Evolution, and we looked at very, closely and deeply at certain things like extremity in rock, right? And one of the things is extreme vocal, right? And I remember as a kid, the first albums I ever got were like Steppenwolf and Creedence Clearwater Revival. And for years I thought, that wasn't heavy stuff. And then I discovered heavy stuff, right? And then I go back and think, I think I liked that because even though it wasn't heavy metal, subconsciously I was going towards love and heavy metal. But John Fogerty had a pretty extreme voice. John Kay had an extreme voice, right? And Brian Connolly is kind of the same way. And it's one of the reasons why he was bounced out of the band. He didn't treat himself well, but he also had a lot of vocal fry on his voice. He blew out his voice. And so he always had a lot of trouble with his voice, but the drinking and drugging and all that didn't help either, right? But that was one of the things we liked about that band is that he was a bit of a powerful shouter in that band.
Yeah, no, it's always hard when you lose your front man. And there was a famous ballroom brawl, unfortunately, right before a tour, where some thugs really, had
Yeah.
Brian down on the ground and stomped on his throat, which
Yeah.
certainly didn't help. But
Yeah.
that's that pub culture where you're down in the pub, and there's a lot of real testosterone and burly men, there. So Brian Connolly might not fit in so well, with some of that crowd. But if you could hold up the book, I'd love to see a few of the pictures, show everybody the depth of what you got here. Rebel
Yeah.
Rouser,
So there's your
Sweet
front
User
cover.
Manual, the great Andy Scott.
Yeah, and then on the back we've got kind of a later picture. You've got Gary Moberly over there too, the part-time keyboardist in the band. And I think we've got Steve here and Brian. And then so it's like all my books, big wordy book, but then I've got the black and whites throughout. A lot of the advertisements, they had a ton of ads in all those old magazines, right? And then there are two tipped in color sections that look kind of like that. Right. So 2 4-page sections of that and 286 pages and just, a chapter per album, make sure I talk about every song, some analysis of the songs and whatnot. I got inspired to do a little more of that, like breaking down what's going on in the songs when I had to do these big books called Led Zeppelin, all the albums, all the songs, The Clash, all the albums, all the songs, where I had to write 400 to 500 words on every single song of the catalog. So that got me doing a little more of that in some of these books I'm doing. That you like this Rush trilogy, the new one is out soon, the last one of that one. So yeah, there's a lot of that in here. Big, pretty thick book. And like I say, a pretty long epilogue that goes through the whole, drama, although it's low level drama because no one cares anymore, but the drama of having a UK suite and a California suite. And the California suite only managed a live album, right? But Andy's suite, they had Sweet Life, and then they had Live at the Marquee, and they had right? That thing. So, Andy Scott suite or Steve Priest, there's the fight there. And then there was even a Brian Connolly suite, briefly, right? So nothing much came of consequence there. But, Andy in his frame of mind realizes that his life, though, like we don't look at it this way, but in Andy's mind, the band more or less continued because he's punching in the clock and going to work every day and doing this for all those years, right? So he gets his back up a little bit when people kind of forget that this band was a working band over and over and over for lots and lots of years after 1981, 1982, when essentially the albums end. So when the albums end, that's where you really kind of fall out of consciousness, because these records that had been released, all over the world very regularly and properly. They were a big corporate band. When that goes away, we kind of forget about these bands. But yeah, they kept working essentially.
Yeah, well, loving music like we do, just hearing a few hits is not enough. You want to
Mhm.
dive in and get to know a band, and that's why I love your shows, and of course Pete Pardo's, See Tranquility. I love it. I always get excited when there's a band I know, but I don't know their catalog that well, and you're counting down the top songs or the top albums, because I'm like, if I really want to, you know start to get to know this band a little more than I do, where do I start? What do you guys think are the best albums? And it's super exciting, for a music lover and a music historian like myself that just can't get enough, of great bands. And I do think one of the greatest joys is for you, if you love a style of music like hard rock music, and you've heard of a band like Sweet, but don't really know them that well, on programs like what we're doing right now, breaking down what are those albums. If I go get two or three albums, or which songs are on which albums, it really helps. But
Yeah.
obviously with Spotify and all that, you can dive into the catalog so easily. But
Mhm.
hats off to Andy Scott, Steve Priest, Mick Tucker, Brian Connolly. All rest in peace, except Andy. And I know Andy will carry on to the last chord, But what an amazing run they had. Our special guest has been Martin Popoff. As always, such a pleasure, Martin. Go get the book Rebel Rouser, on the Great Suite. And what else do you have coming up? What's your next books, Martin?
Well, soon we're going to have another one in this visual biography series we're doing through Weimar. That's going to be on Uriah Heep. And I have the third of the Rush trilogy. So this is called Anthem, Rush in the 90s and in the End. Follows up. Or no, did I say Anthem? Driven, Rush in the 90s and in the End. The first one was Anthem, Rush in the 70s. The second one was Limelight, Rush in the 80s. So those are 3 hardcovers. Still got all of those at martinpopoff.com. What else? Oh yeah, I've got a very strange Blue Oyster Cult Imaginos related project coming soon, where I did illustrations in this crazy timeline about the occult origins of World War I. So that's coming out soon. That's at the printer right now. So that pretty much wraps it up for what's coming down the pipes soon. And the Angel book just came out. So we had the Angel book. It's been a few months now, 2-3 months. So that was called The Fortune on the Rocks with Angel.
Well, lots to discover. You definitely want to go to martinpopoff.com, check out all those great books, and get out there and crank up some Sweet, man. It feels good to hear those songs. And like I always say, great music from that era keeps you young. Or it reminds you when you were a teenager, or as in so many of these bands they've influenced. You got to be a teenager to life, for to have that rock and roll attitude. You can never let that childlike, zeal for great music die. Martin, always a pleasure. Can't wait for our next talk. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.